Theodore Roosevelt, the man, the myth, the legend, served as the 26th President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. As a public figure, he was defined by his robust masculinity and exuberant personality. He was a man who wrote the book on being a manly man. He was a man of virtue, of intelligence, a man who embraced the strenuous life, bettering himself through the trials and tribulations he faced. Teddy Roosevelt was a skilled hunter and avid outdoorsman. These personal passions carried over into his political life, influencing his progressive Republican ideals and leading the charge to preserve public lands through the creation of numerous national parks and monuments. A lot of the hiking territory we have in America today stems from the efforts of Roosevelt, and a large part of our contemporary national image can at least be partly attributed to him. Teddy has imparted his influences upon everything from our beautiful natural landscapes, to our backwood hunting and survivalist culture, to our long-distance trails, and even the preservation of historic cowboy personas. It can all be traced through Roosevelt. You may be less aware of Roosevelt's status as a prolific writer. Before and after his presidency, Roosevelt supported his family through his writing on a wide range of topics including history, biographies, editorials, memoirs, nature studies, and guidebooks. He published around 50 books in his lifetime, not counting the numerous articles and estimated 150,000 letters he wrote. His local mailman moved quite a lot of paper. In today's episode of the Better Hiker podcast, we're going to be taking a look at Hero Tales from American History, a book Theodore Roosevelt co-authored with Henry Cabot Lodge. In Hero Tales, Roosevelt identifies a couple dozen men he claims are American heroes. Some are politicians, some are pioneers, and many are warriors, American soldiers. We're going to focus on three men who helped colonize America, three pioneers who moved west, conquering the land and people in their path. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, and Francis Parkman are American heroes according to the annals of elementary school history books, but we know that there was a dark side to America's creation as well. Most of it was dark side, in fact, and these men all played a role in it. There was war, lots of it. The natives were slaughtered and displaced. European nations tried to stake claim throughout the North American territories, but our heroes pushed them back by any means necessary. It's all a matter of perspective. Heroes are subjective. Teddy Roosevelt may have been an American champion who is revered for his staunch commitment to his virtues and ideals, but through his writings you can see where he was lacking compassion or perhaps a broader, more understanding view of the people, the humans his nation fought against. So take this episode for what it is, and take Teddy Roosevelt for who he was. He favored self-reliant people like himself who persevered through life with resilient hearts and resolute minds. There is a lot we can learn from this man to better ourselves, a lot we can learn from the heroes he describes in this book, but know that they were not perfect and that we can be better than they were. Let's start this off by reading Roosevelt's introduction to his book. It helps identify why he thinks the men we're going to hear about are national heroes worth remembering. This book's purpose is to tell in simple fashion the story of some Americans who showed that they knew how to live and how to die, who proved their truth by their endeavor, and who joined to the stern and manly qualities which are essential to the well-being of a masterful race, the virtues of gentleness, of patriotism, and of lofty adherence to an ideal. It is a good thing for all Americans, and it is especially a good thing for young Americans, to remember the men who had given their lives in war and peace to the service of their fellow countrymen, and to keep in mind the feats of daring and personal prowess done in time past by some of the many champions of the nation in the various crises of her history. Thrift, industry, obedience to law, and intellectual cultivation are essential qualities in the makeup of any successful people. But no people can be really great unless they possess also the heroic virtues which are as needful in time of peace as in time of war, and as important in civil as in military life. As a civilized people, we desire peace, but the only peace worth having is obtained by instant readiness to fight when wronged, not by unwillingness or inability to fight at all. Intelligent foresight in preparation and known capacity to stand well in battle are the surest safeguards against war. America will cease to be a great nation whenever her young men cease to possess energy, daring, and endurance, as well as the wish and power to fight the nation's foes. No citizen of a free state should wrong any man, but it is not enough merely to refrain from infringing on the rights of others. He must also be able and willing to stand up for his own rights and those of his country against all comers, and he must be ready at any time to do his full share in resisting either malice domestic or foreign levy. Daniel Boone will always occupy a unique place in our history as the archetype of the hunter and wilderness wanderer. He was a true pioneer and stood at the head of that class of Indian fighters, game hunters, forest fellers, and backwoods farmers who, generation after generation, pushed westward the border of civilization from the Alleghenies to the Pacific. As he himself said, he was an instrument ordained of God to settle the wilderness. Born in Pennsylvania, he drifted south into western North Carolina and settled on what was then the extreme frontier. There he married, built a log cabin, and hunted, chopped trees, and tilled the ground like any other frontiersman. The Allegheny Mountains still marked a boundary beyond which the settlers dared not go, for west of them lay immense reaches of frowning forest, uninhabited save by bands of warlike Indians. Occasionally some venturesome hunter or trapper penetrated these immense wilderness, and returned with strange stories of what he had seen and done. In 1769, Boone, excited by these vague and wondrous tales, determined himself to cross the mountains and find out what manner of land it was that lay beyond. With a few chosen companions he set out, making his own trail through the gloomy forest. After weeks of wandering, he at last emerged into the beautiful and fertile country of Kentucky, for which, in after years, the red man and the white strove with such obstinate fury that it grew to be called the Dark and Bloody Ground. But when Boone first saw it, it was a fair and smiling land of groves and glades and running waters, where the open forest grew tall and beautiful, and where innumerable herds of game grazed, roaming ceaselessly to and fro along the trails they had trodden during countless generations. Kentucky was not owned by any Indian tribe, and was visited only by wandering war parties and hunting parties who came from among the savage nations living north of the Ohio or south of the Tennessee. A roving war party stumbled upon one of Boone's companions and killed him, and the others then left Boone and journeyed home, but his brother came out to join him, and the two spent their winter together. Self-reliant, fearless, and the frowning defiles of Cumberland Gap, they were attacked by Indians and driven back, two of Boone's own sons being slain. In 1775, however, he made another attempt, and this attempt was successful. The Indians attacked the newcomers, but by this time the parties of would-be settlers were sufficiently numerous to hold their own. They beat back the Indians, and built rough little hamlets surrounded by log stockades at Boonesboro and Harrodsburg, and the permanent settlement of Kentucky had begun. The next few years were passed by Boone amid unending Indian conflicts. He was a leader among the settlers, both in peace and in war. At one time he represented them in the House of Burgesses of Virginia. At another time he was a member of the first little Kentucky Parliament itself, and he became a colonel of the frontier militia. He tilled the land, and he chopped the trees himself. He helped to build the cabins and stockades with his own hands, wielding the long-handed, light-headed frontier axe as skillfully as any other frontiersman. His main business was that of surveyor, for his knowledge of the country and his ability to travel through it in spite of the danger from Indians created much demand for his services among people who wished to lay off the tracts of wild land for their own future use. But whatever he did and wherever he went, he had to be sleeplessly on the lookout for his Indian foes. When he and his fellows tilled the stump-dotted fields of corn, one or more of the party were always on guard, with weapon at the ready, for fear of lurking savages. When he went to the House of Burgesses, he carried a long rifle, and traversed roads not a mile of which was free from the danger of Indian attack. The settlements in the early years depended exclusively upon game for their meat, and Boone was the mightiest of all the hunters, so that upon him devolved the task of keeping his people supplied. He killed many buffaloes, and picked the buffalo beef for use in the winter. He killed great numbers of black bear and made bacon of them, precisely as if they had been hogs. The common game were deer and elk. At that time none of the hunters of Kentucky would waste a shot on anything so small as a prairie chicken or wild duck, but they sometimes killed geese and swans when they came south in the winter and lit on the rivers. But whenever Boone went into the woods after game, he had perpetually to keep watch lest he himself might be hunted in turn. He never lay in wait at a game lick, save with ears strained to hear the approach of some crawling red foe. He never crept up on a turkey he heard calling, without exercising the utmost care to see if it was not an Indian, for one of the favorite devices of the Indians was to imitate the turkey call, and thus allure within range some inexperienced hunter. Besides this warfare, which went on in the midst of his usual vocations, Boone frequently took the field on set expeditions against the savages. Once when he and a party of other men were making salt at a lick, they were surprised and carried off by the Indians. The old hunter was a prisoner with them for some months, but finally made his escape and came home through the trackless woods as straight as the wild pigeon flies. He was ever on the watch to ward off the Indian inroads, and to follow the war parties and try to rescue the prisoners. Once his own daughter and 2 other girls who were with her were carried off by a band of Indians. Boone raised some friends and followed the trail steadily for 2 days and a night. Then they came to where the Indians had killed a buffalo calf and were camped around it. Firing from a little distance, the whites shot 2 of the Indians, and rushing in, rescued the girls. On another occasion, when Boone had gone to visit a salt lick with his brother, the Indians ambushed them and shot the latter. Boone himself escaped, but the Indians followed him for 3 miles by the aid of a tracking dog, until Boone turned, shot the dog, and then eluded his pursuers. In company with Simon Kenton and many other noted hunters and wilderness warriors, he once and again took part in expeditions into the Indian country, where they killed the braves and drove off the horses. Twice bands of Indians, accompanied by French, Tory, and British partisans from Detroit, bearing the flag of Great Britain, attacked Boonesboro. In each case Boone and his fellow settlers beat them off with loss. At the fatal Battle of the Blue Licks, in which 200 of the best riflemen of Kentucky were beaten with terrible slaughter by a great force of Indians from the lakes, Boone commanded the left wing. Leading his men, rifle in hand, he pushed back and overthrew the force against him. But meanwhile the Indians destroyed the right wing and center, and got around his rear, so that there was nothing left for Boone's men except to flee with all possible speed. As Kentucky became settled, Boone grew restless and ill at ease. He loved the wilderness. He loved the great forests and the great prairie-like glades, and the life in the little lonely cabin, where from the door he could see the deer come out into the clearing at nightfall. The neighborhood of his own kind made him feel cramped and ill at ease, so he moved ever westward with the frontier, and as Kentucky filled up, he crossed the Mississippi and settled on the borders of the prairie country of Missouri, where the Spaniards who ruled the territory made him an alcalde or judge. He lived to a great age and died out on the border, a backwoods hunter to the last. Thermopylae had its messengers of death, but the Alamo had none. These were the words with which a United States Senator referred to one of the most resolute and effective fights ever waged by brave men against overwhelming odds in the face of certain death. Soon after the close of the Second War with Great Britain, parties of American settlers began to press forward into the rich, sparsely settled territory of Texas, then a portion of Mexico. At first these immigrants were all well received, but the Mexicans speedily grew jealous of them and oppressed them in various ways. In consequence, when the settlers felt themselves strong enough, they revolted against Mexican rule and declared Texas to be an independent republic. Immediately, Santa Anna, the dictator of Mexico, gathered a large army and invaded Texas. The slender forces of the settlers were unable to meet his hosts. They were pressed back by the Mexicans, and dreadful atrocities were committed by Santa Anna and his lieutenants. In the United States, there was a great enthusiasm for the struggling Texans, and many bold backwoodsmen and Indian fighters swarmed to their help. Among them, the 2 most famous were Sam Houston and Davy Crockett. Houston was the younger man, and had already led an extraordinary and varied career. When a mere lad, he had run away from home and joined the Cherokees, living among them for some years. Then he returned home. He had fought under Andrew Jackson in his campaigns against the Creeks, and had been severely wounded in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He had risen to the highest political honors in his state, becoming governor of Tennessee, and then suddenly, in a fit of moody longing for the life of the wilderness, he gave up his governorship, left the state, and crossed the Mississippi, going to join his old comrades, the Cherokees, in their new home along the waters of the Arkansas. Here he dressed, lived, fought, hunted, and drank precisely like any Indian, becoming one of the chiefs. Davy Crockett was born soon after the Revolutionary War. He too had taken part under Jackson in the campaigns against the Creeks, and had afterward become a man of mark in Tennessee, and gone to Congress as a Whig. But he had quarreled with Jackson, and been beaten for Congress, and in his disgust he left the state and joined the Texans. He was the most famous rifle shot in all the United States, and the most successful hunter, so that his skill was a proverb all along the border. David Crockett journeyed south by boat and horse, making his way steadily toward the distant plains where the Texans were waging their life and death fight. Texas was a wild place in those days, and the old hunter had more than one hairbreadth escape from the Indians, desperadoes, and savage beasts ere he got to the neighborhood of San Antonio and joined another adventurer, a bee hunter, bent on the same errand as himself. The two had been in ignorance of exactly what the situation in Texas was, but they soon found that the Mexican army was marching toward San Antonio, whither they were going. Near the town was an old Spanish fort, the Alamo, in which the 150 American defenders of the place had gathered. Santa Anna had 4,000 troops with him. The Alamo was a mere shell, utterly unable to withstand either a bombardment or regular assault. It was evident, therefore, that those within it would be in the utmost jeopardy if the place were seriously assaulted. But old Crockett and his companion never wavered. They were fearless and resolute, and masters of woodcraft, and they managed to slip through the Mexican lines and join the defenders within the walls. The bravest, the hardiest, the most reckless men of the border were there. Among them were Colonel Travis, the commander of the fort, and Bowie, the inventor of the famous Bowie knife. They were a wild and ill-disciplined band, little used to restraint or control, but they were men of iron courage and great bodily powers, skilled in the use of their weapons, and ready to meet with stern and uncomplaining indifference whatever doom fate might have in store for them. Soon Santa Anna approached with his army, took possession of the town, and besieged the fort. The defenders knew there was scarcely a chance of rescue, and that it was hopeless to expect 150 men behind defenses so weak could beat off 4,000 trained soldiers, well armed and provided with heavy artillery, but they had no idea of flinching and made a desperate defense. The days went by, and no help came, while Santa Anna got ready his lines, and began a furious cannonade. His gunners were unskilled, however, and he had to serve the guns from a distance, for when they were pushed near, the American riflemen crept forward under cover, and picked off the artillerymen. Old Crockett thus killed 5 men at one gun. The walls of the Alamo were battered and riddled, and when they had been breached so as to afford no obstacle to the rush of his soldiers, Santa Anna commanded that they be stormed. The storm took place on March 6, 1836. The Mexican troops came on well and steadily, breaking through the outer defenses at every point, for the lines were too long to be manned by the few Americans. The frontiersmen then retreated to the inner building, and a desperate hand-to-hand conflict followed, the Mexicans thronging in, shooting the Americans with their muskets, and thrusting at them with lance and bayonet, while the Americans, after firing their long rifles, clubbed them, and fought desperately, one against many, and they also used their Bowie knives and revolvers with deadly effect. The fight reeled to and fro between the shattered walls, each American the center of a group of foes, but for all the strength and wild fighting courage, the defenders were too few, and the struggle could have but one end. One by one the tall riflemen succumbed, after repeated thrusts with bayonet and lance, until but 3 or 4 were left. Colonel Travis, the commander, was among them, and so was Bowie, who was sick and weak from a wasting disease, but who rallied all his strength to die fighting, and who, in the final struggle, slew several Mexicans with his revolver, and with his big knife of the kind to which he had been given his name. Then these fell too, and the last man stood at bay. It was old Davy Crockett. Wounded in a dozen places, he faced his foes with his back to the wall, ringed around by the bodies of the men he had slain. So desperate was the fight he waged that the Mexicans who thronged round about him were beaten back for a moment, and no one dared to run in upon him. Accordingly, while the lancers held him where he was, for, weakened by wounds and loss of blood, he could not break through them, the musketeers loaded their carbines and shot him down. Santa Anna declined to give him mercy. Some say that when Crockett fell from his wounds, he was taken alive and was shot by Santa Anna's order. But his fate cannot be told with certainty, for not a single American was left alive. At any rate, after Crockett fell, the fight was over. Every one of the hardy men who held the Alamo lay still in death. Yet they died well avenged, for 4 times their number fell at their hands in the battle. Santa Anna but a short while in which to exult over his bloody and hard-won victory. Already a rider from the rolling Texas plains, going north through the Indian Territory, had told Houston that the Texans were up and were striving for their liberty. At once in Houston's mind there kindled a longing to return to the men of his race at the time of their need. Mounting his horse, he rode south by night and day, and was hailed by the Texans as a heaven-sent leader. He took command of their forces, 1,100 Stark riflemen, and at the Battle of San Jacinto, he and his men charged the Mexican hosts with the cry of "Remember the Alamo!" Almost immediately, the Mexicans were overthrown with terrible slaughter. Santa Anna himself was captured, and the freedom of Texas was won at a blow. The stories in this volume deal for the most part with single actions, generally with deeds of war and feats of arms. In this one I desire to give, if possible, the impression, for it can be no more than an impression, of a life which in its conflicts and its victories manifested throughout heroic qualities. Such qualities can be shown in many ways, and the field of battle is only one of the fields of human endeavor where heroism can be displayed. Francis Parkman was born in Boston on September 16, 1822. He came out of a well-known family and was of a good Puritan stock. He was a rather delicate boy, with an extremely active mind and of a highly sensitive, nervous organization. Into everything that attracted him he threw himself with feverish energy. His first passion, when he was only about 12 years old, was for chemistry, and his eager boyish experiments in this direction were undoubtedly injurious to his health. The interest in chemistry was succeeded by a passion for the woods and the wilderness, and out of this came the longing to write the history of the men of the wilderness, and of the great struggle between France and England for the control of the North American continent. All throughout his college career, this desire was with him, and while in secret he was reading widely to prepare himself for his task, he also spent a great deal of time in the forests and on the mountains. To quote his own words, he was fond of hardships, and he was vain of enduring them, cherishing a sovereign scorn for every physical weakness or defect, but deceived, moreover, by the rapid development of frame and sinew, which flattered him into the belief that discipline sufficiently unsparing would harden him into an athlete. He slighted the precautions of a more reasonable woodcraft, tired old foresters with long marches, stopped neither for heat nor for rain, and slept on the earth without blankets. The result was that his intense energy carried him beyond his strength, and while his muscles strengthened and hardened, his sensitive nervous organization began to give way. It was not merely because he led an active outdoor life. He himself protests against any such conclusion, and says that if any pale student glued to his desk here seek an apology for a way of life whose natural fruit is that pallid and emasculate scholarship, of which New England has had too many examples, it will be far better that this sketch had not been written. For the student there is, in its season, no better place than the saddle, and no better companion than the rifle or the oar. The evil that was done was due to Parkman's highly irritable organism, which spurred him to excess in everything he undertook. The first special sign of the mischief he was doing to himself and his health appeared in the weakness of sight. It was essential to his plan of historical work to study not only books and records, but Indian life from the inside. Therefore, having graduated from college and the law school, he felt that the time had come for this investigation, which would enable him to gather material for his history and at the same time to rest his eyes. He went to the Rocky Mountains, and after great hardships, living in the saddle, as he said, with weakness and pain, he joined a band of Ogallala Indians. With them he remained despite his physical suffering, and from then on he learned, as he could not have learned in any other way, what Indian life really was. The immediate result of the journey was his first book, instinct with the freshness and wildness of the mountains and the prairies, and called by him The Oregon Trail. Unfortunately, the book was not the only outcome. The illness incurred during this journey from fatigue and exposure was followed by other disorders. The light of the sun became insupportable, and his nervous system was entirely deranged. His sight was now so impaired that he was almost blind, and could neither read nor write. It was a terrible prospect for a brilliant and ambitious man, but Parkman faced it unflinchingly. He devised a frame by which he could write with closed eyes, and books and manuscripts were read to him. In this way he began the history of the Conspiracy of Pontiac, and for the first half-year the rate of composition covered about 6 lines a day. His courage was rewarded by an improvement in his health, and a little more quiet in nerves and brain. In 2.5 years he managed to complete the book. He then entered upon his great subject of France in the New World. The material was mostly in manuscript, and had to be examined, gathered, and selected in Europe and in Canada. He could not read, he could write only a very little, and that was with difficulty, and yet he pressed on. He slowly collected his material and digested and arranged it, using the eyes of others to do that with which he could not do himself, and always on the verge of a complete breakdown of mind and body. In 1851 he had an effusion of water on the left knee, which stopped his outdoor exercise, on which he had always largely depended. All the irritability of the system then centered in the head, resulting in intense pain and in a restless and devouring activity of thought. He himself says, "The whirl and confusion and strange, undefined tortures attending this condition are only to be conceived by one who has felt them." The resources of surgery and medicine were exhausted in vain. The trouble in the head and eyes constantly recurred. In 1858, there came a period when for 4 years he was incapable of the slightest mental application, and the attacks varied in duration, from 4 hours to as many months. When the pressure was lightened a little, he went back to work. When work was impossible, he turned to horticulture, grew roses, and wrote a book about the cultivation of those flowers, which is a standard authority. As he grew older, the attacks moderated, although they never departed. Sleeplessness pursued him always. The slightest excitement would deprive him of the power of exertion. His sight was always sensitive, and at times he was bordering on blindness. In this hard-pressed way he fought the battle of life. He says himself that his book took 4 times as long to prepare and write as if he had been strong and able to use his faculties. That this should have been the case is little wonder, for those books came into being with failing sight and shattered nerves, with sleeplessness and pain, and the menace of insanity ever hanging on the brave man who, nevertheless, carried them through to an end. Yet the result of those 50 years, even in amount, is a noble one, and would have been a great achievement for a man who had never known a sick day. In quality and subject and method of narration, they leave little to be desired. There, in Parkman's volumes, is told vividly, strongly, and truthfully the history of the great struggle between France and England for the mastery of the North American continent, one of the most important events of modern times. This is not the place to give any critical estimate of Mr. Parkman's work. It is enough to say that it stands in the front rank. It is a great contribution to history, and a still greater gift to the literature of this country. All Americans certainly should read the volumes in which Parkman has told the wonderful story of hardship and adventure, of fighting and of statesmanship, which gave this great continent to the English race and the English speech. But better than the literature or the history is the heroic spirit of the man, which triumphed over pain and all other physical obstacles, and brought a work of such value to his country and his time into existence. There is a great lesson as well as a lofty example in such a career, and in the service with such a man rendered by his life and work to literature and to his country. On the tomb of the conqueror of Quebec it is written, "Here lies Wolfe victorious." The same epitaph might with entire justice be carved above the grave of Wolfe's historian. Teddy Roosevelt sold me on Francis Parkman. What a resilient mofo he seems to have been. I'm definitely going to check out his writings to see what he's all about. It's obvious that these men had strong character and hardened souls, both of which can be something to admire and strive to achieve in your own life. While courage may be a virtue which was held steadfast by all of them, there was perhaps a short-sighted understanding of others, and this includes Mr. Roosevelt as well. Remember that an ideal is just that, an ideal. So few who have ever existed have truly lived up to the ideal they sought for, or which the wistful eyes of history have labeled them as. Learn from them, but do not envy or emulate them. Live according to your own virtue. Your virtue is the goodness within you that you must work to attain and strengthen each and every day. Take some time to figure out your own desires and needs in life. Who are you? What is it that you truly want to achieve? Sit down and do some thinking for your own good. My favorite philosophical mind from a time gone by, Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wrote to himself in a journal saying, "Whatsoever any person does or says, you must be good, not for anyone else's sake, but for your own nature's sake," as if either gold or the emerald or purple should ever be saying to themselves, "Whatsoever any person either does or says, I must still be an emerald, and I must keep my color." I know I've quoted Marcus before, and I'm likely going to keep doing it. His meditations speak to me, and I find them relevant in relation to just about any scenario. That's it for this episode of the Better Hiker podcast. If you found Teddy Roosevelt's American Heroes interesting, you'll want to check out the feature article we wrote on our website, outlining Presidents George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and Abraham Lincoln, the 3 presidents Roosevelt most admired. He also called them American heroes. Check the article out at betterhiker.com and let us know in the comments if you agree. Thanks everybody. Better yourself and the trails you walk. Be a better hiker. See you next time.
That's it for this episode of the Better Hiker podcast. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to Better Hiker on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For more info and content, check out our website at betterhiker.com. To contribute to the show and receive some extra goodies, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/betterhiker. Thanks for listening.